Have you ever felt like someone is pulling you close one moment and pushing you away the next, and no matter what you do, you can never seem to feel emotionally safe with them? If yes, then you are not imagining it. And you are definitely not alone. There is a quiet pattern playing out in relationships all over the world right now. It does not always look toxic at first. In fact, it often looks like strong attraction, deep connection, intense feelings, the kind of bond that feels different from everything else. But behind that intensity, something unstable is happening, something that slowly drains peace, confidence, and emotional balance. This is what many people are living through without even knowing it. A cycle where love does not feel steady. It feels like a chase that never really ends. At first it feels exciting, the messages, the attention, the emotional highs, but then suddenly distance appears, silence, confusion, overthinking. And the mind starts working overtime, trying to fix what feels like it is slipping away. That is when emotional attachment turns into emotional dependence. And here is the part most people never realize. It is not just about the other person. It is about a pattern, a psychological loop that repeats itself in different relationships with different faces, but the same emotional outcome. One person starts to feel anxious, not because they are weak, but because their nervous system begins to associate love with uncertainty. They start checking, waiting, overthinking small changes in tone, timing, energy. Their mind becomes hyper alert, always scanning for signs of distance, because to them, distance feels like danger, and the other person, they start to feel overwhelmed, not because they do not care, but because closeness starts to feel like pressure. Expectations feel heavy, emotional intensity feels suffocating, so instead of leaning in, they pull back, not always completely, not always consciously, but enough to create space. And that is where the trap begins, because the more one person pulls away, the more the other person tries to get closer. And the more one person tries to get closer, the more the other pulls away. It is like a silent emotional dance where both people are reacting to fear, not love, and neither of them fully understands the role they are playing. This is why it feels so confusing, because it is not stable rejection, and it is not stable love either. It is inconsistency, and the human brain struggles the most with inconsistency. Psychologically, the mind does something very powerful here. It starts to chase what is unpredictable, because unpredictability creates emotional spikes, and emotional spikes feel like passion. But in reality, they are stress signals in disguise. That is why people in this cycle often say things like, "I know this hurts me, but I cannot let go." Or, "When it is good, it feels amazing, but when it is bad, it destroys me." That is not love in its pure form. That is the nervous system getting addicted to highs and lows. And the most dangerous part is this: the brain starts to normalize the chaos. Calm starts to feel unfamiliar. Silence starts to feel suspicious. And peace starts to feel boring. So the person unconsciously returns to what is emotionally intense, even if it is painful. This is how the trap strengthens over time. Not because people want pain, but because the mind confuses intensity with connection and fear with love. But here is something important you need to hear right now. If you are in this cycle, it does not mean you are broken. It does not mean you are too emotional. And it does not mean you are not worthy of stable love. It simply means your emotional system has adapted to inconsistency. And what is learned can also be unlearned. Most people stay stuck because they think this is just how love is supposed to feel. They think real love must be hard, that real connection must involve anxiety, that if they are not chasing, they are not loving deeply enough. But that belief is the very thing keeping the cycle alive, because real connection does not constantly activate fear. Real connection does not keep your nervous system in survival mode. Real connection does not make you question your worth every few days. Yet millions of people are living inside this emotional loop right now, calling it love, when in reality, it is a cycle of attachment wounds reacting to each other. And the truth is, once you start seeing it clearly, something powerful begins to shift. You start noticing patterns you ignored before. You start understanding reactions instead of personalizing them. And slowly, the emotional grip begins to weaken, because awareness changes everything. And what you are about to understand next will show you exactly why this cycle forms in the first place, and why breaking it starts from a place most people never think about. The moment awareness begins to grow, a deeper question naturally appears. If this pattern is so common, why does it feel so personal every time it happens? To understand that, you need to look beyond surface level emotions and into something more fundamental about human connection. Most people believe relationship struggles come from compatibility, timing, or personality differences, but beneath all of that, there is a quieter structure shaping emotional behavior. A structure formed by early emotional experiences, past attachments, and the way the mind learns to interpret closeness and distance. This structure is not visible at first. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself through repeated emotional reactions that feel automatic. A sudden urge to reach out, a sudden need to withdraw, a feeling of panic when communication changes, a feeling of suffocation when expectations rise. These reactions are not random. They are learned responses stored deep in emotional memory, and here is what makes it even more powerful. Most people do not notice they are repeating a script. They believe they are reacting to the present moment. But in reality, they are reacting to familiar emotional patterns from the past, replaying themselves in new situations. This is why two people can meet, feel intense attraction, and still fall into confusion within a short time. It is not because they are wrong for each other in a simple sense. It is because their internal emotional systems are speaking different languages. One system equates closeness with safety, but only when it is consistent and predictable. The other system equates closeness with pressure, especially when emotional expectations rise too quickly. When these two systems meet, both interpret the same relationship in completely different ways. What feels like connection to one person can feel like restriction to the other. What feels like space to one can feel like abandonment to the other. Neither interpretation is fully correct or incorrect. They are just different emotional conditioning patterns interacting, and when these patterns interact without awareness, something subtle begins to form, a constant misreading of intentions, a repeated misunderstanding of emotional signals, a growing sense that effort is not being matched, even when both people are trying in their own way. This is where confusion deepens, because instead of recognizing emotional differences, the mind starts creating personal meaning. Silence becomes rejection. Slow replies become disinterest. Desire for space becomes lack of care. Emotional intensity becomes desperation. Every action gets filtered through fear-based interpretation. Over time, this creates a mental state where the relationship is no longer experienced directly. It is experienced through anticipation. The mind starts predicting outcomes before they happen. It starts preparing for loss even during moments of closeness. And this anticipation slowly drains the ability to stay present. At the same time, emotional dependency begins to develop in a very subtle way. Not as a conscious decision, but as a gradual shift in focus. Attention becomes centered around one person's behavior, mood, and availability. Inner stability starts to depend on external signals. A message becomes relief, a delay becomes distress, a compliment becomes temporary calm. This is not about weakness, it is about the nervous system adapting to inconsistency. When emotional signals are unpredictable, the brain increases monitoring. It becomes alert. It tries to regain control through observation, analysis, and repeated checking. This creates a loop where the more uncertain things feel, the more attention they receive. And attention strengthens emotional importance. What begins as attraction slowly turns into emotional preoccupation. Thoughts become repetitive. Scenarios are imagined. Conversations are replayed. Small details are overanalyzed. The mind is not trying to create suffering. It is trying to find certainty in uncertainty. But in doing so, it amplifies emotional instability. On the other side, the person who experiences pressure or emotional intensity may begin to respond by creating distance, not always in a dramatic way. Sometimes it is subtle, delayed responses, reduced emotional expression, shorter communication, a need to regain internal space. But this distance is interpreted through fear by the other side, and that fear increases pursuit. The more pursuit increases, the more distance is created. Not because either person intends harm, but because both are trying to regulate discomfort in opposite ways. This is how misunderstanding becomes structural. It is no longer about one argument or one situation. It becomes a repeated emotional rhythm between two nervous systems trying to find balance in incompatible ways. And the most important part is this: both individuals often believe they are the one trying harder. Both feel misunderstood. Both feel emotionally exposed in different ways. This mutual feeling of imbalance strengthens attachment even further because emotional struggle can mistakenly feel like depth. But depth without stability becomes turbulence. There is also a psychological factor that makes this pattern extremely difficult to notice while inside it. The brain tends to focus on moments of relief more than moments of discomfort, so when connection feels good, even briefly, it gets magnified in memory. It creates a belief that things are improving even if the overall pattern remains unchanged. This selective emotional memory keeps hope alive, and hope, in unstable dynamics, often delays clarity. It keeps attention invested in potential rather than reality. It makes people focus on what the connection could become instead of what it consistently is. This is why stepping back mentally can feel so difficult, because the mind is not only attached to the person, but also attached to the possibility of resolution. The idea that if things align just right, everything will finally feel secure. Yet without understanding the underlying structure of these emotional responses, the same dynamic tends to reappear in different forms, different people, same emotional rhythm, different situations, same internal reactions. And this is where a deeper realization starts to emerge. The problem is not only what is happening between two people, it is also how the mind is interpreting closeness, safety, and uncertainty at a deeper level than conscious thought. Once this becomes clear, the next question naturally arises. If this pattern is learned, how does it begin in the first place, and why does it feel so automatic, even when it causes distress? To understand where this emotional pattern begins, it is important to look at how the mind first learns the meaning of connection. Long before adulthood relationships exist, the nervous system is already forming expectations about closeness, attention, and emotional availability. These early impressions are not stored as clear memories. They are stored as feelings. And those feelings quietly shape how later relationships are experienced. If emotional attention was inconsistent in early life, the brain learns to stay alert. It begins to monitor signals closely. Small changes in tone, timing, or behavior become meaningful. The system becomes sensitive, not because it is overreacting, but because it has been trained to detect shifts in emotional environment. This creates a pattern where uncertainty is not just uncomfortable, it feels important to track. At the same time, if emotional expression was limited or overwhelming in early surroundings, the mind may develop a different adaptation. Instead of moving toward closeness, it learns to create distance when emotional intensity rises. This is not a conscious choice. It is a protective mechanism designed to maintain internal balance when emotional input feels too strong or unpredictable. When these two adaptive patterns meet in adulthood, interaction becomes complex. One system moves toward connection when uncertainty appears, the other system steps back when intensity increases. Both are trying to restore equilibrium, but in opposite directions. This creates a repeating friction that feels difficult to resolve through logic alone. Over time, this friction builds internal tension. The mind starts to associate relationships with emotional effort rather than ease. Even moments of calm can feel temporary, as if something might shift at any time. This anticipation keeps the nervous system engaged, preventing full relaxation into the experience of the present moment. Another important element is how emotional regulation becomes externally dependent. Instead of stabilizing feelings internally, the mind starts to rely on feedback from another person's behavior. A message, a delay, a tone, or a lack of response becomes the trigger for emotional shifts. This creates a system where stability is constantly outsourced, making independence of emotion feel difficult to maintain. As this continues, the sense of self can begin to fragment. There is the version that appears when connection feels secure, and another version that appears when uncertainty rises. One seeks closeness and reassurance. The other withdraws to avoid discomfort. This internal split creates confusion about personal needs, because reactions keep changing depending on external input. This instability is often mistaken for deep emotional sensitivity or strong attachment, but underneath it is a lack of consistent internal grounding. The emotional state is being shaped moment to moment by external signals rather than a stable inner reference point. This is why reactions can feel intense and unpredictable, even when the situation itself is not changing dramatically. Another layer of this pattern is reinforcement through repetition. Each time uncertainty is followed by reconnection, the brain records a strong emotional contrast. That contrast becomes memorable. It stands out more than steady experiences. Over time, the mind begins to expect that emotional relief will come after tension. This expectation unconsciously strengthens attachment to cycles that contain instability. Because of this reinforcement, calm and steady interaction can sometimes feel less stimulating, not because it is less valuable, but because it does not produce the same emotional contrast. The nervous system becomes accustomed to fluctuations and begins to interpret intensity as meaningful engagement. This can make balanced connection feel unfamiliar or even uninteresting at first. Meanwhile, communication styles continue to diverge. One person may seek clarity through more interaction, more expression, and more emotional confirmation. The other may seek clarity through space, silence, or reduced emotional pressure. Both strategies are attempts to reduce internal discomfort, but they often create the opposite effect in the relationship dynamic. Misinterpretation grows in this environment. Intentions are filtered through emotional state rather than actual meaning. A neutral action can be perceived as rejection. A delayed response can feel like emotional withdrawal. A request for space can feel like disconnection. These interpretations build a narrative that may not reflect reality, but feels real because of the emotional intensity behind it. As the cycle continues, emotional energy becomes concentrated around uncertainty. The mind invests more attention in trying to decode behavior than in experiencing the relationship itself. This creates a state where analysis replaces presence, thinking replaces feeling, and anticipation replaces connection. This mental shift has a cost. It reduces emotional clarity, it increases fatigue, and it slowly erodes the sense of ease that healthy connection is meant to provide. Instead of feeling supported, the internal experience becomes reactive, always adjusting, always interpreting, always preparing. Yet despite this strain, leaving the cycle is not straightforward, because within the same pattern that creates discomfort, there are also moments of relief, brief alignment, temporary understanding. Short periods where everything feels stable. These moments become emotionally significant, not because they define the relationship, but because they interrupt distress. Those interruptions create attachment. The mind begins to hold on to the possibility of return to those moments. It starts to believe that stability is achievable if conditions are just right. This belief keeps engagement active, even when the overall experience remains inconsistent. What makes this even more complex is that both individuals often experience similar internal justification. Each believes that understanding is possible if the other person adjusts slightly. Each believes that effort will eventually lead to balance. This mutual hope keeps the pattern alive longer than expected. But beneath all of this is a deeper truth. The cycle is sustained not by lack of care, but by mismatched emotional regulation strategies interacting without awareness. Each response is logical within its own system, yet incompatible when combined. This is why the dynamic feels so persistent and difficult to change through simple communication alone. And as this realization deepens, attention naturally begins to shift toward responsibility. Not responsibility in terms of blame, but in terms of internal awareness. Because once the structure of this pattern is understood, the focus slowly moves away from trying to control external behavior and toward understanding internal emotional responses that keep the cycle active. This leads to a crucial question. If these reactions are learned and reinforced over time, is it possible to unlearn them and rebuild a way of relating that does not depend on emotional fluctuation? The answer begins with a shift in focus that most people overlook. Instead of trying to change external reactions, the real transformation starts by understanding internal response patterns in real time. This is where the cycle begins to weaken, not through force, but through recognition, because what is recognized clearly loses its unconscious power. When emotional reactions arise automatically, they often feel like truth. A sudden urge to reach out feels like necessity. A sudden feeling of withdrawal feels like protection. But these reactions are not instructions. They are signals, and signals can be observed without being obeyed immediately. This small separation between feeling and action is where control slowly returns. At first, this space feels uncomfortable. The mind is used to immediate response. It expects quick action to reduce tension. But when action is delayed intentionally, even slightly, something important happens. The intensity begins to soften. The emotional wave that once felt overwhelming starts to lose momentum. This creates room for clarity that was not available in reactive states. Another important step is recognizing the difference between emotional urgency and emotional importance. Urgency creates pressure. It demands instant resolution. Importance, however, remains steady even without immediate action. Many people confuse urgency with meaning, which leads to decisions made under internal stress rather than thoughtful awareness. As this distinction becomes clearer, the relationship with internal thoughts begins to change. Instead of treating every emotional signal as a problem to solve, it becomes possible to observe it as temporary movement within the mind. This shift reduces identification with emotional fluctuations and allows a more stable internal presence to develop. Over time, this creates a new internal reference point. Instead of relying on external feedback to determine emotional state, awareness begins to return inward. This does not mean ignoring others or disconnecting from relationships. It means no longer allowing external behavior to fully dictate internal stability. Emotional grounding starts to come from within rather than from response patterns around it. As this internal grounding strengthens, perception of interaction changes. Moments that once felt highly charged begin to appear less absolute. A delayed response no longer automatically signals rejection. A quiet phase no longer instantly triggers fear-based interpretation. Space begins to feel neutral instead of threatening. This neutrality is essential for breaking conditioned emotional cycles. Another shift happens in attention direction. Previously, attention was often pulled outward, scanning for signs, changes, and emotional cues. Now, attention begins to include internal states as well. This dual awareness creates balance. Instead of being fully absorbed in external signals, there is now space to notice internal reactions simultaneously. This balanced awareness reduces impulsive interpretation. It slows down meaning-making, and in that slowing, accuracy improves. Many misunderstandings that once escalated emotionally begin to lose their impact because they are no longer automatically accepted as truth without reflection. At this stage, emotional dependence also starts to weaken, not through detachment from care, but through reduction of urgency-driven validation seeking. The need for immediate reassurance decreases gradually. This creates emotional space where self-regulation becomes more consistent and less reactive. An important realization emerges here. Stability is not created by eliminating emotional intensity, but by learning how to move through it without losing internal structure. Emotions still arise, but they no longer define identity or dictate immediate behavior. They become experiences rather than commands. As this develops, relational expectations also begin to shift. Instead of seeking constant alignment, there is greater acceptance of natural differences in expression and timing. This reduces pressure on interaction and allows more realistic understanding of human variability. Not every pause means distance. Not every closeness guarantees security. Meaning becomes less extreme and more grounded. Another layer of transformation involves breaking the association between emotional intensity and connection value. Previously, strong emotional fluctuation may have felt like depth. Now, steadier interaction begins to reveal its own form of strength. Consistency starts to feel more valuable than emotional extremes. This reevaluation changes what is perceived as meaningful engagement. With this change, internal tolerance for silence also improves. Silence no longer immediately triggers narrative construction or emotional escalation. Instead, it becomes a neutral space where assumptions are paused. This pause prevents unnecessary emotional escalation and preserves mental energy. As internal reactivity decreases, decision-making becomes clearer. Choices are no longer driven by immediate emotional pressure, but by longer perspective awareness. This leads to more aligned actions not based on fear reduction, but on actual personal understanding. At this point, the cycle that once felt automatic begins to lose its structural grip. It may still appear externally, but internally it no longer produces the same level of disruption. The emotional response no longer fully matches the old pattern. This mismatch is what slowly dissolves the cycle's influence. However, The process is not about becoming emotionally detached or indifferent. It is about developing the ability to remain internally steady while still engaging meaningfully. Connection does not disappear. It becomes more conscious, less reactive, more stable. This shift also brings a deeper sense of personal responsibility. Not responsibility for controlling others, but responsibility for managing internal experience. This change in focus is crucial, because when internal state is no longer outsourced, emotional independence naturally strengthens. And as this independence grows, a new question begins to form. If internal stability can exist without constant external reassurance, what kind of relationships become possible when two emotionally aware individuals meet without the need to trigger or escape from each other?